The leather jacket hanging on the back of Jake Iron Morrison's chair wasn't meant to be a hiding place. It was just where he'd tossed it after pulling into Mickey's Roadhouse on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of night when the Pennsylvania air carried the promise of winter and the smell of dying leaves. The jacket was battle-worn, scarred from 15 years of riding with the Iron Wolves, patches telling stories of brotherhood, loss, and roads traveled under starlit skies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jake had been nursing the same cup of black coffee for 20 minutes, letting the familiar sounds of Mickey's wash over him. The clink of pool balls, the low rumble of conversation between truckers and bikers, the hiss of the espresso machine that Mickey himself operated with the precision of a master craftsman. This was sanctuary, a place where men like Jake could exist without judgment, where the weight of their past didn't follow them through the door. The Iron Wolves had made Mickey's their Tuesday tradition for 3 years now. Not because the coffee was exceptional, though it was strong enough to wake the dead, but because Mickey Torino understood the unspoken rules of sanctuary. He'd served time himself, back in the day, and he knew that sometimes broken men needed a place to just be broken without explanation or apology. Tonight, Jake's crew was scattered around their usual corner of the Roadhouse. Diesel Martinez, massive and intimidating, until you saw him reading poetry on his phone between hands of poker. Cage Williams, whose laugh could fill a room, but whose eyes still carried shadows from 2 tours in Afghanistan. Razor Thompson, whose real name was actually Marcus, but who'd earned his road name for his precision with everything from motorcycle repairs to identifying trouble from a standstill mile away. And Snake Petrov, the youngest of them at 28, whose gentle nature, with animals and children, always surprised people who judged him by his intimidating appearance. They were family, these men, not by blood, but by choice. Brothers forged in fire, bonded by shared understanding that sometimes life breaks you so completely that the only way to heal is to find others who understand what shattered looks like. Jake was thinking about this, about brotherhood and healing, when he felt the first gentle tug against his chair. It was so slight he almost missed it, a whisper of movement, like a small animal seeking shelter. Jake's hand stilled on his coffee cup, his senses sharpening. 15 years of riding had taught him to notice things others missed. The slight change in engine pitch that meant trouble ahead. The way a person's posture shifted when they were about to throw a punch. The almost imperceptible tremor that meant someone was afraid. The second tug was more deliberate, accompanied by the softest sound imaginable. A child's sob, barely audible above the Roadhouse noise, but unmistakable once heard. Jake's blood went cold. There shouldn't be any children in Mickey's. It wasn't that kind of place. And the sound carried a desperation that made every protective instinct Jake possessed snap to attention. "Please," came a whisper from behind his jacket, so quiet he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Please don't let him find me." The voice belonged to a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and it carried the kind of terror that made grown men's hands curl into fists. Jake had heard that tone before, in his own daughter's voice during the custody battle that had torn his world apart. The sound of a child who'd learned that adults couldn't always be trusted, that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. Jake didn't turn around immediately, didn't make any sudden movements that might scare the child further. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee and let his eyes sweep the Roadhouse, looking for what had driven a little girl to seek shelter behind a stranger's jacket. The Roadhouse was busy for a Tuesday night. A handful of truckers occupied the corner booths, route maps spread between coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches. A young couple played pool, laughing at missed shots and celebrating lucky breaks. 2 construction workers argued good-naturedly about the upcoming football season while Mickey polished glasses behind the bar. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing except the growing tension Jake could feel radiating from the small presence behind his chair. "Sweetheart," Jake said quietly, not turning around, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "What's your name?" The silence stretched so long he thought she might not answer. Then, barely audible, "Emma." "Emma's a beautiful name," Jake said, maintaining his calm tone. "I'm Jake. Are you hurt, Emma?" Another long pause. "No, not, not yet." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Not yet. As if hurt was inevitable, just a matter of timing. What kind of world did this child live in, where pain was an expectation rather than an exception? "Where are your parents, Emma?" "Mommy's." Emma's voice caught, and Jake heard the distinctive hitch of a child trying not to cry. He pushed her. She hit her head, and there was blood. "And she's not moving, and I try to wake her up, but she won't wake up, and he said if I told anyone he'd make sure I disappeared like Aunt Sarah did." Jake's coffee cup hit the table harder than intended, the sharp sound drawing looks from his crew. Diesel's head came up immediately, his radar for trouble as finely tuned as Jake's. Cage stopped mid-story, his attention shifting to his president. In the language of brotherhood, they all understood something was wrong. "Emma," Jake said carefully. "Who is he? Who pushed your mommy?" "My stepdad, Richard. He was drunk again and yelling about money. And mommy tried to calm him down, but he got madder and madder, and then he—" She couldn't finish. Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. The kind of anger that had gotten him into trouble before, but that he'd learned to channel into protection rather than destruction. Behind him, a little girl was describing a scene that sounded like attempted murder, and somewhere out there was a man who thought he could hurt women and children without consequences. "Emma, how long ago did this happen?" "I don't know. It was getting dark when I climbed out my window. I've been walking and hiding and walking some more. My feet hurt." Jake estimated it was nearly 10 o'clock. If Emma had been running since dusk, she'd been on her own for at least 3 hours. 3 hours of a child navigating the night alone, driven by fear so profound she'd rather trust strangers than return home. "You did good, sweetheart," Jake said. "You were brave and smart to get away. You're safe now." Behind him, Emma's breathing was shallow and quick, the rhythm of someone fighting panic. Jake recognized the signs. He'd seen them in combat veterans, in abuse survivors, in his own mirror during the darkest period of his life. That's when the Roadhouse door exploded open. The sound was like a gunshot, sudden and violent enough to make everyone in Mickey's look up. But it wasn't the noise that made Jake's blood freeze. It was what followed. Richard Walsh didn't walk into rooms so much as he conquered them. Everything about him screamed wealth and power. From his perfectly tailored suit to his platinum watch, to the way he carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no and meant it. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that came from expensive grooming and surgical enhancement. His eyes swept the Roadhouse like searchlights, calculating, predatory. Behind him came 2 men who looked like corporate security, trying to pass for casual customers. They had the build of ex-military or ex-police, the kind of men who got paid to handle problems quietly and efficiently. Their eyes moved constantly, cataloging exits, assessing threats, measuring distances. Jake felt Emma press closer to his chair, her small body trembling with renewed terror. Every instinct told him to turn around, to shield her with his body, but he forced himself to remain still. Sudden movements might draw attention to her hiding spot. "Good evening," Richard Walsh announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and campaign dinners. "I'm looking for my stepdaughter. 8 years old, dark hair, probably confused and frightened. Her name is Emma Walsh." The Roadhouse went quiet. Not the natural quiet of people focusing on something interesting, but the deliberate silence of people sensing danger. Mickey stopped polishing glasses. The truckers paused their route planning. The construction workers. Football debate died mid-sentence. "She's not well," Richard continued, his tone shifting to practiced parental concern. "Mentally unstable. She has episodes where she makes up elaborate stories, accuses people of things that never happened. We've been working with therapists, but she's had a setback." Behind Jake's chair, Emma's breathing hitched. He could feel her fighting not to make a sound. Richard pulled out his phone, showing a photo to Mickey. "This is Emma." Beautiful child, but troubled. Without her medication, she could hurt herself or others. I need to find her immediately. The photo showed a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing what looked like a school uniform. She was smiling, but Jake noticed the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the practiced expression of a child who'd learned to perform happiness for adults. Haven't seen any kids tonight, Mickey said carefully. His tone was neutral, but Jake caught the subtle emphasis on kids. Mickey was a veteran, like most of them. He recognized the signs of a predator in expensive clothing. Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I see. Well, perhaps you wouldn't mind if my associates and I took a look around, just to be thorough. I'm sure you understand. When a child's safety is at stake, we can't be too careful. It wasn't really a request. Richard Walsh was used to getting what he wanted through a combination of authority, intimidation, and the implicit threat of consequences for those who didn't cooperate. That's when Jake decided he'd heard enough. Funny thing about kids, Jake said conversationally, not turning around but letting his voice carry. They usually run towards safety, not away from it. Richard's attention snapped to Jake like a laser finding its target. I'm sorry, but this is a family matter. My stepdaughter is mentally unstable, Jake interrupted, finally turning in his chair to face Richard directly. Yeah, you mentioned that. Couple times now, actually. Makes a man wonder why you're working so hard to convince a room full of strangers that a little girl can't be trusted. The transformation in Richard Walsh was subtle but unmistakable. The concerned parent facade didn't disappear entirely, but something colder showed through the cracks. Jake had seen the look before, in the eyes of men who were used to being feared, who considered resistance a personal insult. And you are? Richard asked, his tone carrying a threat wrapped in politeness. Jake Morrison. Jake stood slowly, his full height impressive, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. President of the Iron Wolves MC. And I'm wondering why a man in a $1,000 suit is so interested in checking every corner of a roadhouse for a little girl who supposedly wandered off. Around the room, Jake's crew began to move. Not aggressively, not threatening, but positioning themselves strategically. Diesel shifted in his chair, giving himself a clear line of free sight to Richard's security. Cage's hand moved casually to rest on the table, but Jake knew he was ready to flip it for cover if necessary. Razor's attention focused on the windows, checking for additional threats. Snake moved closer to the door, his position seeming casual but effectively blocking the most direct exit. It was choreographed without being planned, the result of years of brotherhood and shared understanding. When one wolf was threatened, they all responded. Mr. Morrison, Richard said, and now his voice carried a different kind of authority. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I'm Richard Walsh, Walsh Development. I've built half the commercial properties in this county. I employ over 300 people. I have relationships with judges, police chiefs, district attorneys. You really don't want to make an enemy of me. The threat was clear, professional, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd used his wealth and connections to solve problems before. But Jake had faced down enemies with a lot more than money and lawyers at their disposal. That's real impressive, Jake said dryly. Tell me something, Mr. Walsh. If your stepdaughter is just confused and needs her medication, why do you need 2 armed security guards to bring her home? Richard's jaw tightened. These men are here for Emma's protection. She could be dangerous in her current state. 8-year-old girls usually are pretty dangerous. Diesel rumbled from his table, especially the ones running around without their medication. A few chuckles echoed around the room. Richard's face flushed with anger at the mockery, but he forced his expression back to controlled concern. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gentlemen, I understand your skepticism, but you're interfering with a family crisis. If something happens to Emma because you delayed me finding her, I'll hold you personally responsible. Behind Jake, Emma was so still, she might have been holding her breath. Jake could feel her terror radiating like heat from a fire. Every instinct told him she was terrified of the man claiming to be her protector. "Here's what I think," Jake said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used to address subordinates in the army, calm but carrying absolute authority. "I think you should leave. Come back with the police if you're really worried about finding your stepdaughter. I'm sure they'd be happy to help with an official search." Richard's smile turned predatory. "The police? You want to involve the police?" He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The chief of police was at my Christmas party last year. The mayor owes his election to my campaign contributions. You think small-town cops are going to side with a motorcycle gang over a respected businessman?" The room went dead silent. Richard had just revealed more than he intended, showing his hand in a way that confirmed everything Jake suspected about him. "Well," Jake said quietly, "that's interesting. See, where I come from, innocent people don't usually brag about owning cops. They just call them." Richard's face went white, then red. He'd made a tactical error, let his arrogance override his common sense. Men like Richard Walsh were used to intimidating people through displays of power, but they weren't used to being challenged by people who weren't impressed by wealth or connections. "You're making a mistake," Richard said, his voice tight with rage. "A big one. When this is over, I'll make sure you regret ever hearing the name Walsh." Jake smiled coldly. "Looking forward to it." That's when one of Richard's security guards stepped forward, his hand moving toward his waistband. It was a subtle gesture, professional, but unmistakable to anyone who'd been in similar situations. The Roadhouse exploded into motion. Diesel was out of his chair before the guard's hand reached his weapon, moving with surprising speed for a man his size. The guard found himself face to face with 260 pounds of angry biker who'd learned hand-to-hand combat in Marine boot camp and perfected it in prison. The second guard started to draw his weapon, but Cage was already there, his own military training evident in the way he disarmed the man with clinical efficiency. The guard's pistol hit the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Now that's interesting," Jake observed, looking at the weapons now lying on Mickey's floor. "Concerned stepfather brings armed men to retrieve his sick daughter. That seemed normal to anyone else?" Richard was breathing heavily, his composure finally cracking. "You don't understand. She's dangerous. She's already killed someone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Around the room, men who'd seen violence, who understood the weight of death, went very still. "Who?" Jake asked quietly. "My first wife, Sarah. Emma pushed her down the stairs 2 years ago. She was only 6, but she was strong and angry, and..." Richard was improvising now, building a story in real time. "That's why she needs medication. That's why she can't be trusted alone." Behind Jake, Emma made a sound like a wounded animal. Not loud, but unmistakable to anyone listening for it. "That's not true," came her small voice, finally breaking her silence. "Sarah was nice to me. She gave me cookies and read me stories. He's the one who hurt her." Emma stepped out from behind Jake's jacket, small and trembling but no longer hiding. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her expensive clothes torn and wrinkled from hours of running. But her eyes burned with the fierce honesty of a child who decided that truth was worth the risk. "Sarah was going to leave him," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She found out about the bad things he did with money. She had papers hidden in her closet, and she was going to show them to the police. But he found out." Richard's face had gone white. "She's lying. She's sick. She makes up stories. He pushed Sarah down the stairs, just like he pushed Mommy tonight." Emma interrupted, her small voice cutting through Richard's protests like a knife. "And when the police came, he cried and said it was an accident. But I saw him. He wasn't crying until they got there." The Roadhouse was dead silent. Everyone could see the truth written on Emma's face, could hear it in her voice. This wasn't the rambling of a confused child. This was testimony from the only witness to murder. Jake knelt down to Emma's level, his large frame somehow seeming less intimidating as he brought himself to her height. "Emma, sweetheart, what's your mommy's name?" "Jessica Walsh." She's really Jessica Martinez. But she changed it when she married him. Emma wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She's at 1,247 Hillcrest Manor. The big, white house with the tall fence. Jake pulled out his phone, never taking his eyes off Richard, who was looking increasingly desperate. This is Jake Morrison. I need police and paramedics at 1,247 Hillcrest Manor immediately. Domestic violence situation. Woman down, head injury, possibly unconscious. You're making a mistake, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction now. When your lawyers can visit you in prison. Jake cut him off. He turned to Mickey. You got security cameras in here? Mickey nodded. Full coverage. Everything that happened in the last hour is recorded. Good. Because I think the FBI is going to be real interested in seeing this. Jake looked back at Richard. See, when you've got multiple suspicious deaths, that becomes a federal case. Especially when there's evidence of covering it up. Richard made one last desperate play. No one will believe her. She's just a child. A disturbed child with a history of lying. Maybe, Jake said. But they'll believe the recording she mentioned. The papers Sarah hid. The financial crimes Emma talked about. And they'll believe the evidence they find when they dig up your backyard. Richard's face went gray. Emma's mention of papers and financial crimes had hit home, confirming details only someone with inside knowledge would know. That's when the sirens started wailing in the distance. The sound of approaching police cars seemed to snap Richard out of his shock. His eyes darted around the room, calculating odds, measuring distances. For a moment, Jake thought he might try to run. Instead, Richard Walsh did what wealthy men do when cornered. He tried to buy his way out. Mr. Morrison, Richard said, his voice taking on a different tone. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm a reasonable man, a generous man. Perhaps we can work something out. I'm sure your club has expenses, needs. I could be very helpful to you. Jake's expression didn't change. You offering me money to let? You take that little girl? I'm offering you an opportunity to be practical. Emma is confused, traumatized. She needs professional help, not the chaos of a criminal investigation. I can make sure she gets the best care available. Like the care you gave Sarah? Like the care you gave her mother tonight? Richard's mask slipped completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I have friends in places you can't imagine. Judges who owe their careers to me. Politicians who depend on my contributions. Police chiefs who are about to see you on camera threatening to make people disappear. Jake interrupted. Admitting to owning cops. Trying to bribe witnesses. You really think those powerful friends are going to stick their necks out for you after this gets public? The police cars were getting closer. Red and blue lights began flashing through Mickey's windows, painting the interior in alternating colors of law and order. Richard made one final, desperate attempt to control the situation. Emma, he said, his voice suddenly gentle, fatherly. Sweetheart, you know you love your daddy, Richard. You know Mommy would want you to come home. This has all been a big misunderstanding. Emma looked at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for an 8-year-old. You're not my daddy. My daddy died when I was 3. And you're not nice like he was. She turned to Jake, slipping her small hand into his calloused one. Can you make sure Mommy's okay? Can you make sure he doesn't hurt us anymore? Jake squeezed her hand gently. Yeah, sweetheart, we can do that. The police burst through the door just as Richard Walsh's world finally collapsed completely. The lead officer was a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen every kind of human tragedy and developed the fortitude to handle it. This is Sergeant Patricia Chin, she announced. We got a 911 call about a child in danger and a domestic violence situation. Richard immediately tried to take control. Officer, thank God you're here. I'm Richard Walsh, and this is my stepdaughter. She's been kidnapped by these men. No, Emma said firmly, stepping closer to Jake. He's lying. He hurt my mommy, and he killed Sarah, and I heard him on the phone with bad men about money. Sergeant Chin looked around the room, taking in the scene. A little girl clinging to a biker's hand. 2 security guards disarmed and held by members of a motorcycle club, and a well-dressed man whose desperation was palpable. Sir? She addressed Richard. I need to see some identification. Richard fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking. This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here. These men are holding my daughter. She's not his daughter. Jake interrupted calmly. She's his stepdaughter. And about 20 minutes ago, she told us he pushed her mother down the stairs. There's a woman at 1247 Hillcrest Manor who needs medical attention. Sergeant Chin's expression sharpened. We've already dispatched units to that address. Sir, she turned back to Richard. I need you to step outside with me. This is harassment, Richard protested. I'm a respected businessman. I employ hundreds of people. I have relationships with people who won't be able to help you if you've committed felonies. Sergeant Chin cut him off. Outside. Now. As Richard was led away, still protesting his innocence and threatening consequences, Emma remained close to Jake. The other Iron Wolves formed a protective circle around her. These rough men suddenly transformed into gentle guardians. What's going to happen now? Emma asked quietly. Jake knelt down to her level again. Now, the police are going to check on your mommy. If she's hurt, they'll make sure she gets to the hospital. And they're going to investigate everything Richard did. We'll have to go back to him? No, sweetheart. You'll never have to go back to him. Sergeant Chin returned a few minutes later, her expression grim. We found Mrs. Walsh. She's alive but unconscious, being transported to the hospital with a serious head injury. Mr. Walsh is being held pending investigation. She turned to Emma. Honey, I know you've been through something terrible, but I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay? Emma nodded, but she didn't let go of Jake's hand. Over the next hour, Emma told her story again, this time to professionals trained to interview child witnesses. She spoke about Sarah's death, about finding hidden papers, about overhearing phone conversations about money and threats. She described watching Richard push her mother down the stairs, then standing over her unconscious body for several minutes before calling 911 and claiming it was an accident. Each detail was more damning than the last. Emma wasn't just a witness to domestic violence. She was the key to unraveling years of criminal activity. We'll need to place Emma in protective custody while we investigate, Sergeant Chin explained to Jake. But given the circumstances and the fact that she clearly trusts you, we might be able to arrange something temporary. Whatever she needs, Jake said without hesitation. As dawn broke over Pennsylvania, the full scope of Richard Walsh's crimes began to emerge. A search of his property revealed financial documents hidden in the same place. Emma said Sarah had kept papers. Phone records showed calls to known criminals. Bank records revealed money laundering and fraud stretching back years. Most damning of all, a search of the backyard at Hillcrest Manor revealed evidence that someone had been buried and later moved. Soil analysis and cadaver dogs confirmed Emma's story about what happened to Sarah. Richard Walsh wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a killer who'd used his wealth and connections to escape justice once and was preparing to do it again. 3 days later, Jake sat in the hospital waiting room. While Emma visited her mother, Jessica Walsh had awakened the day before, her memory intact, ready to corroborate everything Emma had said. She would need months of physical therapy, but she would recover. More importantly, she would be free. Emma emerged from her mother's room with a real smile for the first time since Jake had met her. Mommy says thank you, she told him. She says you saved our lives. You saved your own lives, Jake replied. You were brave enough to ask for help. That's the hardest part. Emma pulled something from her pocket, a small patch she'd been working on with needle and thread. It was crude, clearly made by a child's hands, but the design was unmistakable. A heart surrounded by wings, stitched in pink and silver thread. I made this for you, she said, offering it to Jake. So, you'll remember me. Jake took the patch carefully, as if it were made of gold. Emma, I could never forget you. But I want you to know something important. If you ever need help, if anyone ever tries to hurt you or your mommy again, you show this to any Iron Wolf you see. He pointed to his club patch, and they'll know your family. Emma's eyes went wide. Really? I'm family? The best kind of family, Jake said. The kind you choose. 2 weeks later, Jake stood in a federal courtroom watching Richard Walsh be arraigned on 17 charges, including murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Emma's testimony was just one piece of a massive criminal case that would send Walsh to federal prison for the rest of his life. As Jake left the courthouse, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Closure. Not just for Emma and Jessica, but for himself. For the father he'd been unable to be to his own daughter. For the protector he'd failed to become when his family needed him most. The Iron Wolves had started as a group of broken men seeking brotherhood and purpose. They'd found both in the most unexpected way. By becoming the shield that protected innocence, the voice that spoke for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The family that chose to stand up when standing up mattered most. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. She was starting at a new school next week, in a new town where no one knew her story. The text was simple. Thank you for being my hero. Jake smiled and typed back. Thank you for being mine. Because sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes broken people are exactly what other broken people need. And sometimes a leather jacket hanging on a chair becomes the sanctuary that changes everything. The Iron Wolves continued their Tuesday tradition at Mickey's Roadhouse. But now the corner table had an additional chair, smaller than the others, with a tiny patch sewn to the back, a heart with wings, stitched in pink and silver thread. Emma's chair, waiting for the day she might need sanctuary again. Because that's what family does. They keep a place at the table, no matter how long you've been gone, no matter how far you've traveled. They remember that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, and sometimes the most broken people have the strongest hearts. And sometimes, just sometimes, love wins. The road belongs to the honest, the table belongs to the family, and the jacket belongs to anyone brave enough to hide behind it and whisper the truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.